I sell Linux and Linux accessories.
I hate Microsoft deeply. I really hate them, and specifically Windows.
Yes.
And the thing that pushed me over the ledge, so we've wanted to do Linux testing for a while now. It is an enormous amount of work. I don't think the audience realizes. You kind of know, but
it is an enormous pain.
Yeah, and so we have automated a lot of our stuff. Those processes don't work in Linux. We could do it. We could also do it manually. But the real thing that made me go, okay, this is worth the investment to start benchmarking Linux for at least GPUs in some capacity, even as a one-off. The reason is recall. Windows recall terrifies me as a user, and I would like to start getting away from Microsoft's personally. And that if we can create any kind of groundswell in the audience where it's like, all right, GN has started benchmarking things, it's working okay, maybe there's a move for the audience. But
you heard it here. Year of the Linux desktop.
Yes. The question is, which distribution should we use to benchmark? Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new Duronaut thermal paste. Thermal Grizzly claims its Duronaut paste is intended for long-term stability and endurance, focusing on paste longevity in addition to the usual performance focus. Thermal Grizzly's Duronaut paste comes with applicators and spreaders and ships in numerous tube sizes, aiming to provide a high-end paste for PC builds and daily driven overclocks by enthusiasts. Learn more at the link in the description below.
There's really, I think, a couple of good options, and it's really kind of two categories of options. And I know you hate it. It's like, the shortest answer I could give you is probably Bazzite. Bazzite is good because it is an immutable distro, and that is important because it is a big philosophical difference in how the system is managed. And then on the other side it's probably a good idea to use Arch or some sort of Arch-derived distro because that's where Valve is doing a lot of work.
Yes.
And some of the bugs that you've already tripped over with Mango HUD and GameScope are related to kernel patches and stuff in the kernel to try to make it run more like Windows. And those will have, the distro and the choices the distro has made will have non-trivial impacts into your gaming benchmarks. And the kernel itself moves so fast that, there's no, things could change week to week, especially when we're talking about stuff on the bleeding edge, and especially when we're talking about bleeding edge GPU driver.
Well, and benchmarks specifically, which are more sensitive to changes than just using them,
And historically, the different GPU companies, if you look at what NVIDIA does and what AMD does, and now also comes Intel, they have all treated kernel versions differently. And Steam with Proton has also treated the distributions indirectly somewhat differently. So with GameScope, there's this thing called it's like a spin lock primitive. There's a certain operation that a bunch of games on Windows use that is an atomic operation, meaning it only takes one step on Linux. On Windows. On Linux, it's a two-step thing. There's not an apples to apples equivalent functionality in the Linux kernel. And so Valve and other thankless maintainers have been working on it. It's like, okay, let's add this thing to the Linux kernel that doesn't exist for any other reason other than to make it easier for people to run Windows applications with great performance on Linux. And depending on which distro you have and how much your distro cares about those kinds of things, you may or may not have the patch. And sometimes that patch will ripple all the way up to, I'm looking at data in Mango HUD and this doesn't make any sense. And you're looking at Mango HUD as a program, but that's not actually where you should look to see if it's a problem. It'd be actually in the kernel
We need
logs.
to explain a few things. So, so from a benchmarking standpoint, when our team was testing the Steam Deck, the way we collected data was with Mango HUD and GameScope. And so these are utilities you can use to collect frame time data and other data to evaluate the performance. So that's what you're talking about there. Patrick and I discovered a number of bugs in those, especially in early Steam Deck and Proton.
And they're still there. There's still more.
We were able to work around them, but the big danger that we kind of noticed in that testing process was, okay, there's ways you as a tester could use this software and not realize the data is very bad.
Yes.
And think that it's something else.
And the audience trying to reproduce your results are going to undoubtedly trip over a landmine. Even something as innocent as a week-to-week kernel version change is like, oh, we rolled in the patch that fixes the thing, and now it's 7 FPS faster.
Right. Or something that looks 7 FPS faster, but is actually just like an interpretation error of the software. If we're trying to set up benchmarking for Linux, I guess if we start with my objectives are I hate Windows, and I would like to provide even if it's the smallest stepping stone in the world, some kind of stepping stone where people who are trying to move to Linux are like, okay, I at least have some charts with some resources of performance. Because in theory, talking about the GPU vendors, there may be excursions from their hierarchy in Windows in Linux because of the driver differences.
Yes. I think that in that context, I think Bazzite is a really good choice because, and it's different, like Bazzite is more different as a Linux distro than Arch Linux is different from Ubuntu, which is like, everybody I feel like knows that there's a huge difference between those two. Bazzite is this idea of an immutable distro, which means that when you install a package or you change the state of your system, it defines and locks down every aspect of the state of your system. So you can't easily drop to a command line terminal and make a change that is like a U change. Like if you treat your
Someone
computer...
is writing an account right now.
Yeah, it's
actually, you can do that.
You don't want to, because the different ways that people nest in their computer, for lack of a better way to describe that, can also lead to performance variability.
Yes.
It's like, I did this thing from this Reddit post I found from 7 years ago, and it's like, it didn't seem to do anything bad, and yet a couple of months later, it did something bad. And so Bazzite sort of helps you keep your system in a known state. This is also some of the philosophy that has led to like flat packs that you might have heard of, or other packaging systems like that. So it's like you don't just download the flat, like Discord. You download the flat pack version of Discord, or you want the flat pack version of Steam. And I do not like flat pack for Steam, but I do like flat pack for Discord. And so it just depends on what kind of an application it is. A flat pack is more isolation. There's more work that you have to do to access the system.
Okay.
But it ensures more compatibility. Like VLC is a flat pack. You can be assured that you've got the right versions of all the codecs, and generally the VLC flat pack experience, or that kind of a thing in a flat pack experience, because it's not always necessarily true with VLC specifically, is a better experience because it's completely packaged and it's not dependent on other stuff in your system being completely compatible.
All right, so the base requirements, I think, for running benchmarks, it's going to be game compatibility, software for doing the measurements, which we have, likelihood of use in a real-world user scenario. So if we're testing like the perfect version of Linux for benchmarking, but nobody runs it, then that's not useful, obviously. We'd like to do SteamOS. Patrick and I have been trying to get that, like a desktop distro for that. Could do the handheld one, but it's not, like the goal of that would be, okay, this would be widely used and representative, and we know Proton does some really cool things through SteamOS, but that's not viable right now because they haven't given it to us.
Also good old games, and there's another launcher that's not just for Steam that can launch good old games and and Epic and... That is also not something you should sleep on, because that gives you more interesting fine-grained control of what's going on with Proton and some other stuff with that.
Right. So in terms of if we want to represent the most currently the most likely user scenario is Windows, I would say in our audience, the vast majority of people interested in moving to Linux are interested at a scale of they probably have not really tried seriously or not in a long time. But they're feeling ready to because of what Microsoft's doing. And so what that gives us is a kind of clean slate. So, Bazzite, it sounds like you're kind of in favor of. Why Bazzite versus, like, say, Arch?
Bazzite is more accessible in the context of everything you just named. I think for new users or users that are coming from a Windows or Mac OS, it provides a better out-of-box experience and it's more consistent with what they expect. I would hope that as they get more comfortable with Linux and they use Linux, that they're more comfortable thinking about things in ways that Mac OS and Linux don't think, or Mac OS and Windows don't think about things, because Linux really could forge its own path, and a lot of the friction with Windows is that you don't come with the right mindset of it's not Windows Lite or True Value Windows. It's like fundamentally different.
Yes.
But Bazzite also it's fiercely militant about maintaining the state of the system, and that is good for new users, because a lot of the problems that people trip over, it's like I knew enough to be dangerous, and then something happened, and then somebody that's trying to help you on a forum or help you troubleshoot, it's very difficult for them to understand what you've done to your system.
I think also once you have to go to a forum, you're really only keeping the most like true enthusiast type users at that point. Most people are going to be like, I don't have time for this, and they're going to go back. What you're describing though, so if you're talking about like the OS Bazzite distribution militantly maintaining a certain state, or at least attempting to do so, don't you get a bunch of, I don't know, core Linux users who are like, no, that's not how Linux is supposed to work?
Well, you still have the choice about the applications. It's really the state of the system. And it also does a good job doing the bookkeeping for all of the stuff it has to keep track of for all the applications you want to use. So if you want to customize it and do that kind of thing, there's a specific place and way that you manage your configuration.
Yeah.
But if you are, say, I want to install a C compiler and do all kinds of stuff with that, you really don't do that on the host operating system. It puts you in a little sandbox, and then you do that inside a sandbox. And that's kind of like the flat pack full. Everything is about sandboxing and an onion of separation.
Do you feel like, does Bazzite still, the way it functions, does it still sort of maintain the general Linux principles of kind of this total openness?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, you can.
It's just more railroaded, I guess, or guide rails maybe?
Yes, the guide rails are a bit militant. And so like I find it limiting even because like the flat pack thing. It's like you can install Steam as a flat pack, but I don't like it because of the limitations that it introduces, and I know enough to not run that way.
Yeah.
And so for people that are a little bit more enthusiastic, I think that an Arch-derived distro like a CachyOS is Arch, but it's Arch with a customized kernel, but you're still using AUR, and it's a little different than Manjaro, for example, and is more oriented toward the kind of people that have the same philosophy that you're looking for, but it's guardrails off.
From a technical benchmarking standpoint, ignoring user scenarios, usability, what might we need to know from the perspective of needing to run benchmarks and do so consistently? So for example, let's start with the basics, game compatibility. Is something like game compatibility or software compatibility across these different distributions we're talking about, Arch, Bazzite, Manjaro, whatever else, is that pretty uniform, or is it distro to distro the games might break still?
Distro to distro the games might break, but mostly in 2025 it's for unusual reasons.
Okay.
And the kernel, like the locking primitive I was telling you about, that is actually, there were a bunch of regular reviewers that weren't showing the performance that they should have because their kernel didn't have spin-lock patching. And so like there's a parameter that you pass, and so every time a game would try to do like a split lock contention, the kernel would warn you that's like, okay, this is supposed to be an atomic locking operation, but it actually took 2 steps, which is a violation of a locking step. And so you get a warning about that in the kernel. And
is that step then actually half the speed for that specific
yes,
step?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that doesn't have necessarily an outsized impact on the game. Like it's not going to make the game run at half speed.
Right.
But whatever that was in the game, if you could micro benchmark that, then yeah, it's going to run bad. And also the overhead of logging that error is also bad. And so that's a really basic thing that a user could trip over, that there's no error, everything works, you just don't get the performance that you should.
What is Proton's role in all of this? So my understanding of Proton pretty much only relates to SteamOS and how we've tested on the Steam Deck. How does it apply, or does it apply elsewhere?
Oh yeah, no, Proton provides like a bed and framework for these applications that are really designed for another platform to interface with the Linux equivalent. And you want that layer to be as thin and lightweight as possible, but there are also a lot of exceptions and gotchas. So it is a Herculean Rube Goldberg machine of simulation and testing and trying to make it work. And so the versions matter a little bit.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing you probably would have to say, like this version of Proton.
Yeah.
Valve and Steam give you the facility to, like, you want to try the current version of Steam or Proton, you want to roll back a version or 2 versions or 3 versions.
We noticed in testing when the Steam Deck first came out, we found that frame time consistency was often better than on something like an Ally with the same, you could use similar hardware. We tested that too with, you could see it in high-speed capture, so it's not just like a capture utility defect, or between Windows and SteamOS, whether you're using PresentMon or Mango and GameScope, Proton was superior in frame time pacing a lot of times.
I will blow your mind even beyond that. Like it's like, yes, and the specific version of Vulkan, the version of the firmware that you've downloaded from Linux-firmware, which comes from AMD, like these are binary blobs that come from AMD, and Linux sort of holds them out there on kernel.org where the kernel comes from. and then it disseminates to the different distributions at various speeds. A common problem is on something like Ubuntu, they're not updating the firmware quick enough. And so like we'll get a driver version or a kernel version, but then we don't have the corresponding firmware and it's supposed to be backward compatible, but it's not. And so all of the stuff that you tripped over has other hidden variables that would also be impacted in terms of kernel version, in terms of firmware, in terms of Mesa, in terms of the Vulkan backend. And then if you're on NVIDIA, it is a whole other enchilada of similar complication with a completely different set of libraries and a completely different team working on those things.
From a methodological standpoint, what controls do we need to be mindful of maintaining? Because like on Windows, I could give you all the controls and it will ignore BIOS at a system level. We've already done that. So, you know, within the OS, what controls are there? What things do we need to be concerned about? Because you were talking about some testers previously not passing a certain flag through and affecting data. So that would be an example of something I want to be aware of before we publish data.
Sometimes sometimes you're not aware of this kind of stuff until after the fact, but the things like there's a bunch of high-level stuff like the version of Mesa and the version of Proton and the kernel version, which implies the driver version, and then what binary blob version the driver version expects. And so like you at least have to document all those things, because then it's like, oh, in this game, in like Deus Ex Mankind, for example, there was a recent regression where it had performed really well, and there was an update to fix something in Vulkan, and it made everything else absurdly fast, but it hurt that one game. And it was because of something that game was doing, but an exception needed to be built to be like, oh, if you're in Deus Ex Mankind Divided,
don't do this.
Don't do this. And that sometimes that'll come through in Proton.
I mean, that happens in Windows too, just with drivers from NVIDIA or AMD. So.
Well, famously with the Zen 5 launch, a lot of games perform better on Linux than Windows, because Windows had just deteriorated to the point that, you know, Linux, even with all this overhead and all this machinery, is still fast.
That is a complicated topic, though. That's something I'll worry about more when we launch a benchmark. But it's not necessarily fair to present like for like frame rates in the same chart for Windows and Linux. It can be, but the concern is like it's kind of like rendering, you know, DX11 versus DX12 versus, well, let's say a game supports all of them natively or something. It's possible that they're slightly different in the image depending on how the API works. So,
and if I deploy, say, Bazzite on a Zen 2 system with a 720p screen, should I expect the same level of performance as a Steam Deck? And it's like, what kind of, but also probably not. I mean, maybe not. It depends on the level of optimization, because Steam has a lot of these low-level, and Valve is choosing a lot of these variables. And that's also part of the philosophy of like Bazzite, is they're trying to make all of this stuff move a unit at a time. That's
they also have fixed hardware. It almost becomes a console argument, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like, you know what's on there, so you can just build for that, I guess.
Yeah.
For Valve.
Like, oh, what if we encounter a Steam Deck that has an NVIDIA chip? And it's like, oh, all bets are off.
All right, so I think we might, I've already been talking to Patrick about potentially running Bazzite, because a lot of our viewers have suggested it. So we might go that direction. I look forward to people linking this video on Reddit when they argue with people about which distribution people should try. And
CachyOS also, like, for me personally, that's what we're running. So they can come over to Level 1 if they want to see CachyOS.
Otherwise, I mean, I guess, I don't know, we'll probably I think we're going to do our first run all by hand, the old way, and run it all through. I want to start with just GPU benchmarks, because as you know, a CPU test platform is far more complicated with the component swapping, different boards, different OS. We'll start with GPUs and see how
Power state, power management governor. Okay, so this is another fun one. The system, you know how Windows has balanced and performance? Well, Linux has balanced and performance. Linux also has this amazing openness for the performance governor. And so a lot of distros now use a performance governor called like on demand. And so on demand tries to look at your workload, and it's like, oh, this is a bursty workload. And even though the processor can go to sleep, it takes a long time to wake it up. Let's not actually send it to sleep. And that can have an outsized impact on gaming performance that is completely silent and you don't know is there.
Okay.
And versus like just running in performance all the time.
Our general approach to benchmarks is to turn off power saving state type features, just because it's not about like, is it representative of a user scenario or not? It's about consistency run to run.
Yep.
So you don't just get like some run gets whacked for performance, and it tanks the average or something.
The good news is that Linux, because Linux really is a server operating system first and foremost. Like if you look at, is it the year of the Linux desktop? It's been the year of the Linux everything but desktop for like a decade now.
Yes.
Linux is everywhere.
Especially server.
Yeah, and server consistent performance is important. And so you can basically tell it, I want you to behave like a server. And it's like, I'm going to give you the best consistency I possibly can. And that's nice.
Yeah, and again, like it's just for me, it's just we've gotten to a point with Windows where the amount of spying is becoming concerning, and I don't trust any of these. My assumption is any service that collects data and stores it somewhere or can be accessed externally, it's not a matter of if it'll be breached, it's a matter of when.
Yeah. Well, and if you get to a point with the operating system where certain aspects of the operating system architecture, they just can't be bothered, which is what it seems to be from a user perspective, not just, the philosophy of like, this is what we want to do with the operating system. It's just like, this is the rotting undercroft that exists. It's like, that's concerning.
Yeah. Yeah, so we'll put together our first Linux benchmarks pretty soon. Guess we'll run with Bazzite. I look forward to the controversy that is caused by you choosing the wrong distribution for us to test.
Excellent. I'm excited beyond verbalization. Woo!
And otherwise, I guess if you want to check out Linux content, you have multiple channels where that is discussed.
Yes.
Level1 Techs, of course, then you've also got Level1 Linux.
Yeah, we tend to just talk about Linux because some people are militantly Linux only. It's like, okay, I get it. Algorithm, whatever, sounds good.
So check that out. We'll link it below. And thank you, Wendell, for joining me.
No, thanks for having me.
We'll see you all next time.
My ride's here.
Show off.
There goes your train of thought. Don't worry, we're going to do a bunch of retraining on game benchmarking.
God.